Oh, perfect. Yeah.
Are you recording or is Emily recording?
I am recording now.
Aha. And I'll get some photos during the process and you can use those to advertise. So it's wanna be young and dumb, live this for. All right. We've got an hour scheduled, right? And I'll manage the questions once you're done.
Yeah.
Have you got a clock running there or?
I will go and start.
Yep. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming today. I'm very pleased to introduce Gabrielle Sequeira Lucero and her master's thesis defense presentation this afternoon. It has been a real honor to be Gabby's primary supervisor for her master's. She is amazing, phenomenal, has done fantastic work. As she will explain, she had to pivot from Egypt to South Africa for her master's field work. And our colleagues there, my colleagues there that I have a long-standing relationship with, are very, very impressed and they keen for her to come back and spending time with her in the field there. You just see the really good interactions and she's done amazing work. And we went through a practice presentation yesterday and it is awesome. So enjoy. Over to you, Gabby.
Thank you. Cool. I just want to make sure, can everybody on the Zoom hear everything? Does it look like yes, Emily? Yeah, okay, perfect. All right, sweet. Yeah, thank you everyone for being here for my thesis defense presentation. I'm Gabrielle or Gabby, and I'm really excited to share with you what I've been working on. See if my little thing over here works. Okay. Yeah, go for it. So a little bit of background about me. I got my Bachelor of Arts in Environmental Sustainability Studies at NEU with minors in International Studies and Arabic. And when I was going into my master's, I knew that I wanted to get international research experience and some like cross-cultural work and get some experience doing community building restoration projects. So my initial project was going to be focused in Egypt because I had studied abroad there. I had some connections with students and researchers over there already. I was going to be working on participatory restoration with mangroves, but that ended up falling through. So luckily, Duan has a lot of connections over in South Africa. So through him, I was able to get connected to a bunch of research organizations over there, such as Nsasani Trust and SSLI. And the timing worked out pretty great because they were looking for somebody to run a project like this over there anyways. So yeah, worked out great. As we go through this presentation, I'll give you a little bit of background about the problem I've been working on, some of the theory and literature that informed my study, the methodology I chose, the results we found, a discussion of what those results could imply, and then a conclusion. So, to give you a little bit of geographical context, South Africa is the southernmost country in the continent of Africa, and way over on the eastern side is Kruger National Park. And this is the big national park that people tend to go to for their safari experiences, to see lions and elephants, giraffes, etc. If we zoom in a little bit to Kruger, over here on the southwestern edge is the Sabie-Sand catchment area. So this catchment area, or the watershed as we would call it here, is between the Sabie and Sand rivers, and in between them are a bunch of Black rural ranching communities. Most of the people who live in these communities are either refugees that came to the border from the Mozambican Civil War, or they were Black South Africans who were forcibly dislocated from their ancestral homelands during the 1900s. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but yeah, context here is none of these communities are based around long-standing tribal affiliations or centuries of connection to this specific land. So these ranching communities raise a specific type of breed of cattle called Nguni cattle. They're bred for dairy and meat. I think they're pretty cute, but they roam over communal rangelands. So no one rancher in these communities owns their own plot of land for cattle to graze on. Instead, the community all shares the management of these grazing lands, and every cattle owner in each community is free to have their cattle graze on the lands. Back in the day, the grazing lands used to look a little bit more like this. There's a lot of these big South African trees like jackalberry and marula and umbrella thorn acacias. And you can see that these trees are a bit more spread out. There's a lot of grass underneath, lots of open space for grass to grow and animals to graze. However, the grazing lands today look a little bit more like this. So if you can imagine yourself as a cattle owner, having your cattle graze in this area might not be the best. You can see, like in this background, there's not a lot of grass available, and there's a lot of these big spiny bushes that you might get lost in or hurt in if you try to navigate through. This bush in particular is Dicrostachys cinerea, or more commonly known as sickle bush, due to its seed pods having a curved sickle-like appearance. And these bushes are native invasives, native because they did evolve in this area, and so they're from South Africa and they're part of the ecosystem, and they can be very pretty. But invasive because they're very good at taking over a large area of space if given the chance. And because these bushes have taken over a lot of these grazing lands, the lands look a bit like this. The trees are very thick and hard to walk through. Grass doesn't grow very well underneath them. The plants suck up a lot of the water from the ground and decrease the soil quality. If you can see in this picture up here, this top one from 1955, this is kind of what the grazing lands used to look like. So these big open spaces, some of those bigger trees, like I mentioned, all spaced out, versus this bottom picture from 2012, where you can see the plants are a lot more congested and dense. So just a little note on these side-by-side comparisons that seeing more green and more tree cover doesn't always mean that it's a healthier ecosystem. In this case, it's not. But so what happened between 1955 and 2012, and why have these species been able to take over this area so well? We've got a few different theories that can kind of help us get an idea of what went on. The first one is wildfire suppression. So before the 50s, these lands were managed using traditional methods, including burning. So the ranchers would set fire to the lands and let that fire clear out the land for the next growing season. And it would also wipe out a lot of these baby sickle bush. So because it is a native plant, a few of them would survive. They're part of the ecosystem here and there, but most of them would get wiped out by fire. But in the 1920s, Kruger National Park was established. And as you can imagine, those fires crossed over the boundaries into the park and caused a lot of destruction. So in the 50s, the government put into place much stricter land management policies that restricted who was allowed to burn and when. In order to burn, you had to get special trainings and permits, much of which were very inaccessible to these Black ranching communities. So after the 50s, that started this trend towards fire avoidance and wildfire suppression. And with that came a lot of woody bush encroachment. So as I mentioned, those fires would burn through and kill most of the baby sickle bush, right? But all of a sudden, when there isn't that fire, all of the little sickle bush that would have otherwise died in fires have a chance to grow up to adults and start spreading and taking over this land area. So when that happens, that is called woody bush encroachment. If you remember our little side-by-side thing here, like we said in this top picture, there is a lot of space where cattle could graze and spread out, versus this one, there's not as much open space. So because of that, cattle all got compressed and into these more congested areas, forced to graze in these smaller areas where there isn't sickle bush, which leads to a lot of overgrazing, as you can kind of see in this picture. Unfortunately, with that means that a lot of cattle end up getting sick and starving and dying. The last little piece to this puzzle is large tree removal. So like I mentioned, there were a lot of these big native South African trees. However, even though there are national policies and community agreements to not cut down these trees, people end up doing anyway. This is called wood poaching because you can make a lot of money by selling the wood from these trees. And unfortunately, that's something people have resorted to doing in order to support their families. So with the removal of a lot of these large trees comes lower soil quality and more space for the sickle bush to move into that area. So if we know that this has been going on since the 50s, what has been done about it so far? We've had a few different policies and studies and programs and recommendations all focused on combating this bush encroachment and restoring the grazing lands. However, none of them have had the long-term success that they wanted to see. So why not? Why didn't they work? In order to answer this question and hopefully provide some recommendations for future restoration projects, my study used two different theoretical frameworks. The first one is participatory restoration. So the theory of participatory restoration says that when you involve a local community in your restoration project, you're going to see higher levels of long-term ecological success with that restoration. Conversely, if you're using a top-down model where governments or scientists or people in power are making all the decisions and not including the community in those discussions about what happens with restoration, those projects will have lower levels of ecological success. And there's a couple different reasonings for this. One is that if the community is apathetic or disinterested in the program, maybe they haven't been given any information or they don't have a reason to care about the restoration project. Then once that project's funding and contract is over and the project managers leave, if there's nobody still on the ground invested in the project, helping with the maintenance of it, then that project is much more likely to fall apart. On the other side, if the community is actively hostile against the project, they don't like what's happening, they haven't been consulted, they are not a fan of what's going on, then having that pushback against the project can make it hard to get started in the first place, let alone see long-term ecological success. This theory says that there's a lot of different ways that you can engage a community, all the way from just consulting them and gathering information, up to empowering and like the co-decision phase where they have an equal vote in what happens with the project. And none of these are necessarily better or worse than the others. It really depends on how much the community wants to be engaged. So that's part of what my study was focused on finding out. Studies show that most restoration projects today are still using a top-down model, but we are in the middle of this UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, and we're starting to see more of a trend towards this community engagement model. The second framework I was working with is rural institutional trust. So these black ranching communities have really long histories of distrust with the government for pretty good reasons. In 1913, the Native Land Act restricted Black South Africans from 93% of the country, forcibly relocating them into smaller, congested communities in just 7% of the land. In 1948, the National Party was elected on the policy of apartheid. So this is officially when apartheid started. And between the 50s and 80s, the Group Areas Act further relocated Black South Africans away from any good farming land, which they saved for white farmers, and gave them the more rocky and arid farmlands. The 1951 Bantu Act gave the National Party the ability to put into place local chiefs who would be loyal to them versus the communities. So as you can imagine, that caused a bit of distrust between the local communities and their own chiefs, because they knew that those chiefs were representing the government and not them. 1994 brought the official end of apartheid, along with a new constitution that promised land restitution and ecological restoration and better livelihoods for everyone. However, a lot of those promises went unfulfilled, which leads us to today. As you can see from this graph, this was a study conducted between 2011 and 2023 that measured South Africans' trust in their local government systems. And you can see this black bar on the left over here. That is the answer of, I do not trust the government at all whatsoever. And you can see that that has risen over the years. So There's not very much trust in the government within these communities. So using these theoretical frameworks, I came up with 3 different research questions. The first one is, what are the key needs and priorities of the local communities in the Sabie-Sand catchment area related to grazing land management and ecological restoration? Basically, what do the communities care about? What do they value? And what do they want to see? Secondly, what level of interest is there in participatory restoration within the communities? And what types of incentives would increase community participation in restoration activities? So would they be interested in a project if we were to run one? How much would they want to be involved? And what kinds of incentives could help them be more involved? And lastly, which strategies from past restoration efforts have been successful or unsuccessful in engaging the community? So even though those past projects might not have had that long-term success, they might have had some strategies that people really liked or that they would not want to see repeated. So figuring out what those were. To answer these questions, again, we conducted this study over outside of Kruger National Park in this Sabie-Sand catchment area. There's the Sand River, Sabie River. In between them is that catchment area with those communities, which are all part of the Bushbuck Ridge municipality. So we chose 3 communities out of this municipality, which we'll call community A, B, and C for confidentiality reasons. I had the most amazing local study team. So Theo was my research assistant, and he is a master's student in freshwater ecology in South Africa. Promise and Petunia are our community guides. So they were people that we specifically hired from the communities to kind of be a go-between. They're trusted by the researchers and trusted by the communities so they can help arrange meetings and answer questions. And then Tabiso was my translator from the local language of Xitsonga to English. And Tabiso actually got so interested in conservation after all of our focus groups that he ended up applying for an environmental science university program. That's kind of fun. But all 4 of these people are from the local communities, and they were absolutely essential in my study to recommend how the study should be run, how to phrase certain questions to community members, explaining concepts to different cattle owners, and just making sure that the whole study was run in a very respectful way. So shout out to them. All right, the data we collected, we held 3 different focus groups, again, in community A, B, and C. We had 16 individual interviews, so 5 per community, plus 1 community counselor who also asked to be interviewed. And we had 58 participants total, 81% men and 19% women, and they were all either adult cattle owners or adult family members of cattle owners who are there to represent their family. The way that our focus groups and interviews worked, we sent out invitations through WhatsApp. Promise and Petunia handled most of this. They sent out invitations to all of the ranchers within each community to figure out when the best days and times and locations were to meet. And they told us when and where to show up. So yeah, they handled all the logistics, which was amazing. Our focus groups tended to last between 2 and 3 hours, in which Theo and I asked them questions such as, what has your experience been with sicklebush? And have you been part of a past restoration project? And what did you like about it or not like about it? And if we were to do a future one, who would you want to be in charge? What kinds of benefits should the community get, etc. We also gave them maps and asked them to point out areas where there was a high concentration of sicklebush and where they thought would be a good place to start a restoration project. After that, we took volunteers for interviews, and all of our interviewees, they're a pretty good mix between some of the community elders who had a lot of stories and wisdom to share from their time as cattle owners, and then some of the younger cattle owners too, who had a lot of great ideas about how things could be different. After that, we had a catered South African lunch, which was our compensation or our thank you to the communities for their time, which they loved. And then we had our interviews, which were typically around 10 to 15 minutes. And we returned to some of those same questions in the focus group, depending on if there had been debates in that focus group, or if there was anything we were still confused about, or if they had a specific story or strong opinion they wanted to share. In terms of analyzing our data, Theo went through all of our audio recordings and translated them from Xitsonga to English, and he and I compared notes. We conducted manual thematic coding, which is basically a fancy way of saying that we picked out the quotes that we thought were most important and encompassed the community consensus, and we assigned them codes or hashtags to see how many times that theme came up in a certain group. I also digitized all of our maps and layered them, which we included in a report that we're sending over to our research partners for their planning. And we conducted a case study analysis with the past project reports, comparing them to what the community said about past projects to see how it measured up. So some of the key results that we found, there was a really big agreement that sicklebush is a really urgent issue for these communities. There was also a really high enthusiasm for restoration projects. They had a lot of recommendations for us based on the past projects that they had had, and there were a ton of leadership concerns. So those are some of the main ones that we found. I'll go through each of these four and show you some of the quotes that we found to support these results. And as we go through, you'll see there's participant one, community B, etc. If it says participant, it was somebody who spoke up in a focus group. If it's interview, it was a one-on-one interview. So for sicklebush, 14 out of 16 of our interviewees named sicklebush as their most pressing issue. They said things like, this plant is still our biggest problem in the bush. We've had separate projects, and we have also tried to remove it ourselves because it's killing our cows. They said things like, many community members cut a lot of the big trees and leave the sicklebush, enhancing the spread. If they cut the sicklebush, they leave the branches and the thorns hurt the cows. Someone else mentioned that our cows are in a really bad condition. The cows are unable to access feeding spots in most of these areas, and there's no grass where there is sicklebush. They said that the sicklebush is so much that it makes it hard for our cattle to eat, and we have found that sick cattle get stuck in the bush. We just notice a terrible smell only to find cattle dead. And lastly, there has been a change over time from when I was younger in 1985. The grazing for cattle would rotate, and there were much stricter wood harvesting rules. Now there is more sicklebush, and the cattle lack food and movement and places to eat. In terms of restoration, there was a lot of agreement that they would love a restoration project. They said things like, the fact that you're having this meeting with us and speaking with us, asking our needs, is why we believe you can be the right people to assist us with our problem. And they said people will be so happy for a project like this to start because a lot of people supported their families from the jobs they had in the previous project. So this project can help support families. However, there was some disagreement on who should be involved. For example, Community A only wanted cattle owners to be involved in restoration work, and they didn't want anyone who was not a cattle owner to be involved. They said, we have a problem with people who, maybe out of spite or wood harvesting, burn the grazing lands, and this is a problem to us because our cattle run out of grass to eat. So because of experiences like this, they didn't trust non-cattle owner members of the community, and they wanted to keep the involvement to just the cattle owners who were working on the lands. Conversely, Community B is a bit more tight-knit, and they said, here in our village, everyone is involved. The grazing lands belong to everyone. As our cattle graze there, traditional healers use the lands, so the benefits need to go to everyone. Community C took a bit of a mixed approach where they said that they wanted everyone to be involved in the project, but the cattle owners wanted to have first priority and the ability to vet anybody else who was coming in. But overall, 13 of 16 of our interviewees stayed feeling positively toward restoration. In terms of recommendations, there were a lot of them, so I picked out a few. But someone said, in my point of view, the previous project had its success. It's just the time period was short. And maybe there could be a better management system or like a quota for the employees for how much of a space they're required to cut in a day. They also said things like, we would love to have training in fire control on our lands. I have a herder who is fully equipped in fire control, and these skills would be useful for all of us to have. Someone else mentioned that I suggest in terms of resources, offer equipment and teach us how they're used rather than money, as money causes disputes. And someone else mentioned that the most benefits from this project should go to the children of the cattle owners. And this is because some of them will still have cattle which will feed in this area. But yeah, a lot of the incentives they suggested were things like offering equipment and training and job creation and community development initiatives and sustainability or transitional efforts to help them continue projects on their own. Lastly, in terms of leadership, so 6 out of our 16 interviewees mentioned working in a past restoration project, and they had some concerns about how it was managed last time. Some of the concerns they had about the past projects were that there were late payments and sporadic work. They said, I was part of the past project. It was a good job and I enjoyed it. They gave us the equipment and they made all the right promises. The only issue we had with them is that they were not direct and transparent with the payments. Someone else mentioned that our problem is that after the plant is cut, the managers say the project funds are depleted, and then the plant resprouts again, and one can't tell that they were removed in the first place. And someone else mentioned that the problem I faced was that as the workers, we were promised a stable income. Because funds were not released on time for employees, this caused a lot of distrust. In terms of current and future leadership concerns, as we've mentioned multiple times now, these communities have very low trust in their government systems. So they did not want anybody from the government in charge of the project or managing them or telling them how the project should be handled. And some of the communities also had chieftaincy complications. So figuring out who would be the right person in charge to get approval from and how to make it be as peaceful of a process as possible. They said that we would like that you specifically communicate directly to the tribal chief authority since we don't want arguments and fights from this, because they had arguments and fights over who got to give approval in projects in the past. Take a little water break real quick. Alrighty. So for this discussion, I'm going to summarize some of these responses through the lens of my theoretical frameworks and my research objectives, which again were to understand community needs and priorities, understand levels of interest and desired incentives, and identify strategies from past projects. Then we'll talk about some of the broader implications for global land management and some of the recommendations that we gave to our research partners for their actual restoration projects. So the first one, what were the needs and priorities of the communities? We identified three overarching ones. So the community engagement values. So what can the community put in or invest into the project? Benefit distribution. So what can the community get out of the project? And sustainability. So how can the community members continue the project on their own, even after initial funding has run out? These all have connections to those theories that I mentioned. So in terms of community engagement, most of the ranchers that we talked to had never been asked their opinion before, and nobody had ever gone to inquire how they wanted to manage the lands or what they thought should be done about sicklebush. So they noted that even the fact we were having these initial conversations with them gave our research team and our research partners a lot of legitimacy in their eyes and built a lot of trust to show that institutions can and do care about what they have to say. And so yeah, that was pretty cool. And that can help build back a lot of this trust in conservation. In terms of benefit distribution, you saw there was a lot of varying internal distrust within the communities, such as Community B, which is very tight-knit, and they wanted everyone to be involved, and Community A, which had a lot more distrust and a little bit more exclusionary. But even Community A didn't want to completely exclude the other community members. As one of the incentives they suggested, they said we should offer environmental education programs. That way, the non-cattle owning community could understand more why the grazing lands are important and how they're being managed. And they hoped that having those programs would help those non-cattle owners have a better respect and understanding of the grazing lands so that someday everybody could be involved and they'd be able to have that community cohesion again. In terms of sustainability, as I've mentioned multiple times, there's really low trust in government, and these communities have seen time and time again that when they need help, they can't rely on institutions or their government systems to help them. And so even though they're really grateful and excited that our research partners would be kind of fronting a lot of that cost for training and job creation and helping them get started, one of their really big values is that eventually they can run these projects on their own and they don't need to rely on anybody else to keep them going. And of course, our participatory restoration theory says that if project managers align their ecological goals with those community values, there should be a lot more community engagement in the project, leading to higher levels of restoration success later on. In terms of interest and incentives, there was really high interest in this participatory model, which we kind of talked about. In terms of incentives that they suggested things like empowerment incentives. So having that co-decision or that equal vote in how their lands are managed and how the restoration project is run, and being able to design the evaluation methods. So getting to decide for themselves what counts as success in restoration. And then things like livelihood incentives, such as those jobs and the payments, some of those initial and immediate short-term benefits. And then some of the capacity incentives, such as providing equipment and training. So once those like jobs and payments and funding for all of that runs out, they'll still have these capacity benefits or capacity incentives to continue running projects in the long run. Again, all three of these connect to our theories, which if the research partners or project managers take these recommended incentives and actually implement them into their project, they should see a lot more community engagement, a lot more trust and legitimacy built for their institution, and a lot more ecological success. Lastly, what were some of the strategies that we identified? So some of the unsuccessful ones that we saw were things like having that top-down decision-making where communities weren't involved or consulted about what should happen, and having unreliable communication. So the person they were supposed to go to with concerns may or may not ever be there, and having low trust in those governmental systems already, as well as having short funding cycles. So every time the funding would stop, the plants would just regrow and people would have to start all over. And then there was no transitional support. So once those programs were done, that was it. There wasn't any support to help the communities continue projects on their own. But the things they thought were successful and that did help build trust and that they saw were ecologically valuable were things like having the local recruitment. So instead of bringing in outside restoration teams, they hired from the communities. They also provided a lot of that equipment and training for people to learn. The work was really enjoyable and they gained a lot of skills and they used the pay to support their families. And lastly, there was visible ecological recovery. So they reported that even though the project in the long run didn't work and all the plants grew back, they could see that as they were cutting them and while the project was going on, they could see the grass regrowing and the land getting a bit better. So these are the things that they would want to see brought into those future projects. So obviously this study was very specific and conducted in a very specific part of South Africa, but it could have some global implications. So for any other studies or restoration projects that are happening, maybe with some more of these like rural livelihoods, like cattle owning, where it really relies on the ecosystems and the environment to run those livelihoods, or places where they're looking at semi-arid landscapes that maybe also have some of this bush encroachment issue. Anywhere that's looking at using some of this participatory community engagement dialogue in their work, or even just global restoration projects looking for different case studies. Any of these, if people are doing other studies or projects with these topics, my study could help them anticipate some challenges that might come up or what people might say or yeah, what it might look like in the end. And of course, as we are in the middle of this UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, like I mentioned, studies like this are going to be really important for both project managers and communities to figure out how they want these projects to be run. So some of those recommendations that we gave to our research partners, we suggested that they identify community needs and priorities, which is what this study was. So part one complete. We also suggested that they set transparent goals and indicators and milestones for their work and identify different leadership roles. We suggested that they gain permissions from all the local leaderships, figure out which chiefs they need to get approvals from, make sure everyone's on board with the project. In terms of preparatory activities, we suggested they provide those training and tools and that they communicate those leadership roles. So who they should go to with problems, who's going to be in charge of what, and that they communicate the payment structures and schedules so that everybody knows what to expect. We also suggested that they plan for any social conflicts that might come up. And in terms of implementation, we suggested that they continue to foster that collaboration and trust with the communities and to monitor the quality of the work and support the leaders that they put into place. We also suggested that they continue to adapt their methods based on local knowledge. So if people have ideas of how things could work differently or better, that they listen to that and adapt. We also suggested that in terms of monitoring and evaluation, they should share their results transparently with the communities and that they should keep having these meetings to collect feedback and refine their incentives. We also suggested that they track the ecological and social outcomes to see how things are going with both restoration success and better community cohesion. So in conclusion, using these trust building models with the participatory methods can lead to restoring land and restoring that community cohesion and trust, which is a lot better for having sustainable ecological and social outcomes. And any future research in this area should look at strategies to rebuild that trust, assess project sustainability, and provide more guidance for practitioners and project managers. Before I end completely, I want to thank my amazing advisor, Dwan Biggs, for all of his guidance in my master's, Dr. Sarah Souther and Dr. Paul Lins Jr. for being on my committee and all of their encouragement and guidance, Marcia Alejos for setting up the Alejos Goslow Chair, which funded a lot of my research in South Africa, Dr. Lawrence Kruger for hosting me in South Africa and trusting me with this project, and Theo, Promise, Petunia, and Tabuso for being the best study team ever, my Resilient Conservation Lab colleagues for being an amazing academic support group, and of course, all of the Sabie-Sand cattle owners who generously gave their time and their opinions and their stories to help us understand this landscape better. So to end, Zakenza Swenene, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Gabby.
Yeah.
Questions?
You made 2 trips to South Africa.
I did.
So how were your trips different from each other or the same as?
Yeah, totally. So in November 2024, I did a kind of like a pilot study or a scoping visit. So I traveled there for 2 weeks and we did an initial focus group with one of the communities just to test out our questions, see how things were going, and yeah, just to make sure that the study would work. And so yeah, when we came back in July of this year, we expanded it to all 3 communities, and by then we had like refined our questions a bit more and figured out a better system of like how we wanted to run the studies. And so yeah, that was kind of the difference. The first one we didn't really measure anything or take many data points. It was more of like, yeah, scoping visit, but the second one we did. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Ooh, that's a great question. They didn't specifically mention climate change. It was more so the fire and the tree cutting was their big thing. So yeah. Yeah.
So the sort of fundamental ecological drivers that are causing change there are very similar, specifically flood.
Totally.
And I'm wondering whether you can give us a sense of like the level of optimism within these communities in terms of being able to get on top of these problems.
Yeah.
Being able to develop and carry out and maintain successful restorations. It sounds like they were ready to get involved if the project happened, but did they think it was going to work?
That's a great question. I think it sounds like before the initial project started, they were kind of skeptical and they're like, it's a job, I'll work it. But yeah, when they saw that the restoration was actually working and the grass was growing, I think that did give them a lot of hope. And then when the project left, it kind of collapsed again. So when we started these focus groups at the beginning, they did seem very skeptical, like, okay, like many people have come in here and said that we're going to restore the grazing lands. It's like, we've already tried and like, it just doesn't work. But as we talked more about this like participatory model where it's like, we want to hear your opinions, we're not just here to like tell you what to do, then they started getting more excited. And so, yeah, I think they're really hopeful now. Yeah, thanks.
Like there's some conflicting ideas about fire. Like in the introduction, you talked about fire being an important tool for clearing things out.
Yeah.
Grass growth. But then some of your participants thought that fire was going to be bad for grass. Is that about the timing or what kind of variation?
Yeah, it's a kind of like, it's almost 50-50 whether people are like excited, like, oh yeah, we know that fire works and we can use controlled burns and this is like a method that we want to use, versus like fire's bad and it's destructive and we don't like it. So yeah, that's why part of our, hopefully what's going to happen is introducing a lot of like fire trainings, like here's how it works and here's why it can help the grasslands as long as it's done, you know, in these specific ways. And so hopefully that will kind of bring the other 50% on board. And then get things started. But for the most part, they're like, if you're using this method, that's fine. Just like tell us beforehand. But yeah, 50-50 on whether or not they wanted to be involved in it or not. Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the methods and equipment they are using currently to remove the bush? Is it like saws, tractors, and stuff?
Totally. I think they've tried multiple things. So they have tried saws, and I don't know that any of them have tractors specifically, although I think they would appreciate that. And I know they've tried to shovel it out, but it's one of those plants where all the roots are connected underground, so it doesn't work too well. Yeah, I think mostly because of like the equipment needs to clear out all of these miles and miles of sickle bush. It's hard for somebody to go out there with their one saw and be like, okay, I'm making a difference, you know? But yeah, so that is what they're using, and they're hoping for more of those like high-tech tools that they can use to cut brush more efficiently.
Yeah, one more follow-up question.
Yeah.
Did your focus groups talk at all about this side?
They did, yeah. So that's something they use a lot. That's one of the things I think that they were trained in with the last projects is once they cut the bush, they put on the herbicide, and hopefully that stops the bush from growing back again. So yeah, I think our research partners, that's something they're looking into as well. And once they start the projects, which I think is supposed to happen early this next year, they're hoping to do a few different like control plots to try different things and see which one of those works the best and go with that.
But there wasn't like any immediate concern about like herbicides needing to be kept away or.
No, there wasn't. Yeah. Yeah.
This is kind of like a long-term concern. I know plants and tree species over time learn to evolve to fire and like thrive off of it.
Yeah.
Do you think this evolved to that, or just think?
That is a great question. I don't have an answer for you on that one, but that is something I would love to learn. Yeah.
Those like follow-up interviews that happen maybe after focus groups, how structured were those going into them versus like how much were they just reflections on what they got?
Yeah, great question. So they weren't very structured at all. We had a set list of questions that we planned to ask in the focus groups, and we had like highlighted the most important ones. We're like, okay, it's okay if these ones get skipped, but we definitely need to hit these ones. So once we got to the interviews, I think like in one or two of the focus groups, there'd been like big debates. There, the community was like back and forth and back and forth, and then they came to a consensus. And some of them, like, there was, I don't know, just a lot of information that maybe like we missed something, or it's like, all right, I don't understand what the context of this is. So that's in those interviews, we asked more about that. Like, okay, so in this group, like people said this, like, can you explain why maybe they said that, or like what's happening in your community to make this be an important issue? And then, yeah, if they had something specific that they wanted to talk about, like we noticed in the focus group, they had a really strong opinion about something, then in that interview, we'd make sure we bring that up and like, hey, like, tell us more about that. Like, we want to hear why, like, why is this important to you, and what can we do about it? Yeah, thanks. Yeah,
Great presentation.
thank you.
Not to listen to you, but if you had 3 or 4 more layers to actually achieve stuff this sort, what would be some key areas of inquiry that you might
Yeah, I would actually love to do a longer study with this and see if my theories are actually true. Like if we're actually involving the community, is it going to have higher levels of success? And if so, like, is that because of the participatory aspect of it, or is it because of something else? So that's something I would love to look into more. Thanks. Yeah, cool.
What's your most
My most surprising finding. Ooh, that's a good one. I think the fact that my most surprising finding was definitely how many opinions the communities had about it. That probably shouldn't have been super surprising, but reading all of the past project reports, it's like, oh yeah, this was a great project and we did so many good things for the community and the land was totally restored and it was so good. And then we got there and they were like, that project was trash and the manager was terrible. They didn't say it was trash, but yeah, basically it didn't work and nobody listened to us and the payment was a mess and we don't want that to happen again. So that was pretty surprising to see that Even though all of the project reports and like even UN pages were like, it's so good, the actual community members said that it didn't really work. Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Another question about fire and
Mhm.
pollution. Do you know much about what this landscape was like, not just back in the 50s, but like several hundred or 1,000 years ago, before European colonization and then people being shifted on the landscape? Was there natural fire?
That is a great question. I want to assume yes. One might have more answers about that, but yeah, I feel like there probably were natural fires that went through the land, and people used that for their own traditional, yeah, ranching methods.
If I can add to that, I
Yeah.
think the balance of evidence now suggests that most African savannas, so they are human created.
Okay.
Human maintained. So in the absence of humans burning fire to care for grazing or to attract wildlife before they had livestock, which I think they've had for many thousands of years, then it may have been more wooded at times.
That
But
makes sense.
yeah, here, savannas in Africa, even though our media likes here to portray them as wild, they're actually human created systems largely. Any other questions? Perhaps I have one final question. As Claire mentioned, a lot of the ecological challenges here in the Southwest are very similar.
Yeah.
So from your perspective of working in that landscape, which has in some ways some similar social histories of different layers of colonization, people being moved around, what would you see as sort of maybe the insights, comparisons, or inspirations from there to bring to the Southwest?
Great question. Yeah, I feel like something that I've really been inspired to learn more about and work more on after having been in South Africa is some of those like trust issues within ranchers here, and especially indigenous ranchers in the Southwest and the US. Just because I know there is a lot of that history of distrust, and especially with land being taken and turned into national parks in the name of conservation. It's like all these great environmental things, especially when they're coming from the government level, can still be kind of harmful or not great for some of those communities. So being able to kind of work with both of them and be a bridge and figure out ways that we can use some of those like Western science restoration attempts while also making sure that we're not breaking trust or harming a lot of those ranching communities, I think that'd be really cool to work on in the future.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you again for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
All right, I believe everyone who wants to leave can now leave. In the committee, we have our discussion, and then, if I understand correctly, and update me, Claire, Sarah, if I'm missing protocol at MAU, we'll send you a WhatsApp or a little hello, and then you come back in. Is that how it works? Yes?
Cool.
Great. So you can go and grab a coffee.
Do I need to stay?
Pardon?
Yeah, she's the defense.
Oh, the defense. Okay, so
Beer.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
yeah.
Nice job, Gabby.
Right.
Thank you guys. Appreciate it.
Right.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Right.
Thank you. Good. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you so much. Thanks. Thank you.
That was really good.
Thank you so much.
Three other PhD defenses in the last week. And
Oh my
yours
gosh.
was like by far the best.
Really?
Yeah. That was
Thank
really
you.
good. Yeah.
Oh, I practice so much, so.
Yeah.
Shows. Thank you.
Yeah, it was a good project.
Thank you.
So incredibly well done, and the research was so good. That was,
Oh, I appreciate it.
yeah,
Thank
congratulations.
you.
Really excited.
Thanks. Yeah.
Stop your recording.
Oh, okay, yeah.